Good afternoon. My name's Doug Spellman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the U.S. here at the Wilson Center. We're co-hosting today's event with the Asia program, which is headed by Bob Hathaway, who's hiding over on the side of the room. The Wilson Center, as I think many of you know, is the living memorial established by Congress for our 28th president. Our aim is to combine scholarship and policy the way that President Wilson, who of course was also president of Princeton University, attempted to do. I think our speaker this afternoon, Elizabeth Wishnick, illustrates that combination. She's a public policy scholar here at the center. She's also an associate professor of politics and law at Montclair State University and also a senior research fellow at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia. She's published widely on both China and Russia. She works in both those languages. We're delighted to have her here today. She'll be talking on risks posed by China's rising oil demand, which is one aspect of her larger project, a book called China as a Risk Society. Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, Doug, and the Kissinger Institute and the Bob Hathaway and the Asia program for hosting my stay here at the Wilson Center. It's been wonderful, and my only complaint is that it's going by too fast and that I'm leaving you all the end of next week. So this research I'm presenting to you, as Doug explained, is from a larger book project. It's very much a work in progress, and so I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this very important issue. Okay. Many of you may have read a report that came out in very recently called Assessing U.S.-China Distrust. It's a report by Ken Lieberthal and Wang Jise. And in that report, Wang Jise, who's a very well-known academic from Beidai, speaks about the widespread belief in China that China is rising against a background of U.S. decline. And this part of that report has been widely covered. But he made another very important point that hasn't gotten as much attention, and that's the emphasis that Chinese policymakers place on internal political stability in China. And when we think of that, it's easy to summon images of the soap opera now going on in Chongqing, the factional politics surrounding Bo Xilai. But I don't think that's what he was referring to. I think he was talking more deeply about the profound social problems that face China and the concern the Chinese leadership has about these, not just social but economic problems, and the unrest that results from these problems. And because of these issues that China is facing, there has been a debate inside China about what to do with them. And so that's the background to this project, China as a Risk Society, which looks at the weaknesses or the risks in the Chinese economic and political system. This is not to deny the obvious fact of China's impressive economic growth in the past 33 years of reform or its great achievements on the international scale, only to say that the flip side of this are some major problems. And we need to look at the foreign policy and security consequences of these risks. They can be an opportunity for cooperation with other states that face common problems, or conversely, they can be the source of new foreign policy tensions and new security problems. And so this project looks at how Chinese policymakers and society in China manage risk and what this means for the international community. And so this is a globalized world, and we're all connected. And so China's partners are very much vulnerable to the risks facing China. China is a state with multiple neighbors, and so you have a number of transboundary issues. And my project looks not just at oil, it also looks at water issues, food, safety and security, as well as epidemics. And so the transboundary nature of these problems is very apparent. And the project argues that risk management requires adequate regulatory capacity and transparency. And these are areas where China is weak. And so we can discuss China's strengths in many segments, but in these particular areas, China has some weaknesses. And I also argue that the particular nature of China's political and economic system sets limits to the participation of non-state actors in risk management who might be able to do something about some of these transboundary challenges. So what about oil risks? Let's turn now to our main topic. Here what I'm talking about is from the point of view of China and from other states. So from China's perspective, oil risks are twofold. They involve vulnerability to interruptions of supplies and also to the security of transportation of those supplies to China. And so China has taken a series of steps to deal with these vulnerabilities. However, other states tend to interpret these actions as threats. And so a security dilemma is created in that the measures that China is taking to manage its own oil risks leads to concern among other states. And these states may see China in a threatening light as a result. And so this talk will look at this dynamic and how it plays out. It will also look at the question of oil risk from three other perspectives, looking at the role of global markets and the role of energy institutions at the global level and the regional level, and also examining domestic factors and how do they shape China's management of its oil risks. And now for some facts and figures. China became a net importer of oil products in 1993 and of crude oil in 1996. And so now China, you can see these figures, these are from the Energy Information Administration, and they show that China is the number 2 importer of oil after the US. And its reliance on imported oil for its consumption is now at 55%, which in August of 2011 was the first time that China surpassed the United States in this respect. Some estimates believe that China's the imported oil will constitute 75% of China's consumption by 2030. So China's dependence on imported oil is growing. This being said, oil is not the main source of energy in China. It's still coal. Oil accounts for about 20% of China's energy mix. But nonetheless, it's important in particular sectors, in industry and in transportation. 2011 imports are not listed there. This is 2010 figures. China, according to Chinese sources, China imported about 5 million barrels per day in 2011. There's some dispute about what's going to happen this year, and because of the possible slowdown in the Chinese economy. I've seen some Chinese estimates that predict 6% growth, but Kang Wu from the East-West Center predicts 13% increase in 2012 in Chinese imports because of China's interest in stocking its oil reserves further this year in response to external threats. So here are some Chinese and U.S. figures. The top two top two rows are from the China Statistical Yearbook, and the bottom row is from the Energy Information Administration, and I'm missing 2007 figure. but the bottom row shows that U.S. figures report higher demand than the Chinese figures report. Okay, and here this chart shows the gap, the growing gap between production on the bottom and consumption on the top. Okay, where does China get its oil from? 46% of China's imports come from the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia. 19% of Chinese oil comes from Saudi Arabia. Iran is number 2 with 9%, which is important. 23% comes from Africa. In particular, Angola is very important with 16%. And 10% comes from Russia and Central Asia, with 6% coming from Russia and 4% from Kazakhstan. Another 3% comes from the Asia-Pacific region, and then there are other sources. 3%, yeah. So here's a nice map that shows some of the pipelines in Russia and from central Kazakhstan to China. And it also shows you the Malacca Straits, which we're going to be talking about in a few moments. This is from the Defense Department report on the Chinese military from last summer. And this 83% figure illustrates the amount of oil transported, oil bound for China that's transported through the Malacca Straits. And then you see the Strait of Hormuz, another hot point these days, 47% from there. And so these are some of the issues that Chinese policymakers are thinking about when they're concerned about security of transportation, because so much of their oil goes through these hot spots, areas of instability. And a limited amount is coming from the pipelines that are now built, the one from Kazakhstan and the one from East Siberia to Daqing only accounts for some 10% of Chinese oil. So it's not a solution to the 83% going through Malacca. So how does China see its own energy security? As I mentioned before, security of supply and security of transportation are the key issues. And over the past decade, Chinese policymakers have been directing a lot of attention to this issue. Hu Jintao himself expressed concerns about certain powers not named possibly controlling the Malacca Strait. And that's what I meant there by the strait, the Malacca Strait. And so in the years since then, when the so-called Malacca dilemma was mentioned by the Chinese leadership, a series of steps have been taken to try to improve China's energy security position. If you look at the 11th five-year plan, energy security was a big part of that plan. Chinese national oil companies, even before then, were urged to go out and to participate in buying foreign oil, and then later on investing in foreign oil, which has become a source of controversy in the United States and in other countries. In 2008, the financial crisis gave China some opportunities to expand its investments overseas in the oil sector by leveraging loans to oil companies and governments in exchange for access to oil. And if you read the most recent five-year plan, this plan highlights that China still has a problem with sustainable development, despite all of the efforts made to increase percentage of renewable energy. And this plan urges greater efforts towards especially supply diversification and also trying to increase the percentage of clean energy and energy efficiency. But oil is used in certain ways that can't be substituted for by renewables, for example, like powering cars, and in petrochemical industries, you still need oil. So while China is trying to reduce the amount of fossil fuels used, there are certain parameters that the economy needs to operate in. So now we get to these strategic factors that are important in trying to understand how other consuming states, other neighboring states, perceive China's actions and why we have security dilemmas being created. Now, the first the first 5 points I listed there really don't have to do with China's oil policy per se. These have to do with other factors that are seen as related to China's energy strategy. Naval modernization. So as China acquires overseas assets, it needs to be able to protect those assets. And so we've seen in the recent years a concerted effort by China to build up its naval forces. The PLA commander Wu Shangli in 2006 called for a powerful navy to protect fishing, resource development, and strategic passageways for energy. And in some cases, we've seen Chinese arms sales pave the way for energy deals in certain countries, such as Iran and Sudan. And so these types of arms sales have elicited concern, but China is also trying to expand the scope of its navy beyond coastal protection to be able to go to more far-flung areas, for example, to participate in anti-piracy missions, disaster relief, and other kinds of missions. China now has an aircraft carrier program for the first time. It purchased one former Soviet aircraft carrier, the Varyag, and is set to have at least another one by 2020. New base is being built in Hainan Island for submarines. And so this has led to some speculation in the United States and elsewhere that China's building what's called a blue water navy, a navy that's capable of going beyond coastal defense to far-flung areas, such as one the United States has. But others, and particularly in China, many analysts say that this is unrealistic. China doesn't have this capability at the moment, and what really is the focus in China now is trying to secure passage on sea lanes, and that it would be preferable for China to cooperate with the major naval powers, U.S. and India in this region, rather than try to embark on a modernization program of its own. But nonetheless, the fact that China is building up in this area has become an issue of concern. The second issue has to do with the so-called string of pearls, as some defense consultants in the U.S. called Chinese efforts to find places where its ships can call in far-flung areas. And one analysis I read in the Naval War College Review called these places, not bases. So they're not military bases, they're really ports of call where ships can stop for refueling, to purchase supplies of food and water. And China has a network of these around in various countries, in Oman, in Yemen, Djibouti, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Pakistan. And so the location led to the image of the string of pearls. And so this also created in the minds of other states some feeling of Chinese naval expansion. And of course, the hot topic is the South China Sea. And this issue really is not really about oil at the moment, although there are predictions of large reserves. Conservative estimates put this at 28 billion barrels of oil. One Chinese study claims there are actually 213 billion barrels of oil there. But nobody really knows because there are no real confirmed estimates yet because of all the controversy surrounding the claims to that sea. And China has taken a rather ambiguous approach to its claims, adhering on the one hand to a member of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but also talking about its so-called 9-dashed line based on historical precedent. And so China has questioned when Foreign oil companies have begun operations and in some cases pressured them to stop operations. There was talk whether or not China considered the South China Sea a core interest or not. Some in the U.S. government say they heard this said, others say they didn't. And so the Chinese Foreign Ministry denied it. So there's a lot of controversy about what exactly China is aiming for in the South China Sea, and other states at the same time are pressing their own claims. And so this creates some additional uncertainty in the region that colors perceptions of Chinese behavior in pursuit of energy and other resources. And it doesn't help when you have statements like the one Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi made in response to criticism of Chinese behavior in July 2010 at an ASEAN meeting, when he said, "China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's a fact." So that doesn't make small countries feel any better. So you do have these perceptual problems, ambiguity about claims, different conceptions of sovereignty. And then finally you have the problem of Chinese national oil companies and their relationship to the Chinese state. Is this China incorporated? Are Chinese oil companies arms of the Chinese state pursuing the Chinese government's bidding? And so this also creates certain images of what China is up to in terms of its energy investments. At the same time, you have other consuming states facing increasing pressures to find sources of oil. I'll talk about India in a few minutes. And you also have the fact of the Chinese market. China has such a large market, and what it does will affect the oil market. For example, on the one hand, it might be a good thing if China builds up its oil reserves, because that means in case of let's say Iran blocks off the Strait of Hormuz over the summer. If China's not desperately trying to buy all of its oil at the same time everybody else is, that would create greater price stability. On the other hand, when China increases its oil reserves, that does constrain the amount of oil available on the market and create price pressures in the short term. So there are these issues of China's impact on global energy markets and perceptions of it. So is energy going to lead to conflict between China and its neighbors? If we look at these two cases of China and Japan and China, India, there's really a complicated picture here. China and Japan already were competing over gas resources in the East China Sea. Similar to the South China Sea issue, this had to do with contested sovereignty, issue of the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands. And so you had this background, and in this context, the East Siberian pipeline became an option, and you had Russian companies trying to play off Chinese and Japanese investors. So my reading of this is that it wasn't so much Japan and China competing as Russia instigating competition between China and Japan to get a better price or more investment. And this didn't succeed very well because, for one thing, at the time before the Fukushima crisis, Japan was interested in reducing its reliance on oil and using other fuels to make up the difference. Japanese investors have always been wary of the Russian market. And China was trying to get Russia to invest in a connecting pipeline that was eventually built from this, I should return back to the previous slide. You see in the purple on the right-hand corner, this long pipeline. China wanted that green spur to be built from it to Daqing. And so they were promising all kinds of things to get Russia to agree to that, buying shares of the Rosneft company, making a $6 billion loan, etc. But Russia was waiting for a better offer from Japan, which never came. And then Then you had the financial crisis, and so China was able to come in with a new opening with a $25 billion loan to Rosneft, the oil company, and Transneft, the pipeline operator, and secure that spur from the Siberian pipeline to China. But in the aftermath of the nuclear crisis in Japan, Japan is going to have to make up for its lost nuclear power in some way. Largely this will be by LNG purchases, but also there will be increased oil purchases. By some estimates, Japanese oil imports are supposed to increase by more than 6% this year. And so this oil will have to come from somewhere, and this might lead to more competitive pressures between China and Japan. In terms of China, India is a country that relies on imported oil for 70% of its demand at the moment, and this is going to increase to 92% of demand by 2030. And Indian national oil companies have been lagging behind the Chinese companies. They lost to China on many an occasion, famously to China on the Petro-Kazakhstan deal. But they beat China in one case to get the Imperial Oil Company, British company, which invests in eastern Siberia, and they competed successfully against Sinopec. So Indian companies are seen as having less support from their government, being less experienced in international deals, and somewhat more interested in cooperating with Chinese companies than is the reverse. China also won out in Burma and Myanmar on a pipeline deal, but India is still trying to revive an alternative pipeline with Bangladesh and India, and Burma did award India some gas contracts to balance the Chinese interests. But the real controversy between China and India is over Indian cooperation with Vietnam in oil fields off the shore of Vietnam, which Vietnam claims are in its territorial waters, and China says are in that 9-dash line area in the South China Sea. So China's objected to this deal that continues to go on. And so there you do have controversy over oil and sovereignty issues that are being conflated. So what about markets? What about this explanation? Do markets create more incentive for cooperation between China and other states? Alternatively, can China lock up oil supplies, as has been alleged? For one thing, a large percentage of the oil that China produces overseas in these fields we were talking about is sold overseas and not brought back to China. And the amount that's brought back to China really depends on market factors. And so and also the kind of oil that's being produced in those fields, whether China can use that kind of oil or not. And so the highest percentage of oil that's produced in a Chinese owned investment is Kazakhstan, where 23% of the oil goes back to China. But in most cases, it's a very small percentage that actually makes its way back to China. And so when China acquires overseas investments, this oil goes to the global oil markets. So it's not locked up by China, it's put on the market by China. Moreover, the Chinese companies that participate in these overseas investments are now listed on stock exchanges, and they're global oil companies just like any other companies. Robert Manning famously said a while back that even if China had 15 aircraft carriers, it really wouldn't matter if the Persian Gulf oil flows were interrupted. And so because China is a part of the global oil economy, and it is as vulnerable to supply interruptions as other states, and its own growing capabilities in the naval area really doesn't change that reality. And in fact, A study at the Naval War College argued that the U.S. and China really are in a situation of mutual assured dependence in terms of oil with, between the United States and China, where they all have face common risks in terms of needing to focus more on efficiency and conservation, and have similar challenges in terms of exploration. What about price stability? I mean, there you do have questions in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, China is a large country. When it makes purchases in global markets, it does have an effect on price if China's buying more than usual. And so there you do see a negative outcome of China's involvement, or at least you see China's footprint on the global oil market. Okay, what about pipeline projects? So I look at pipeline projects in this chapter as an aspect of economic integration. And I think that there are political factors at stake here as well as economic ones. And in fact, the economics is less clear than the politics. And the first one, in terms of the Russia pipeline I mentioned before, this pipeline has long been discussed since the 1990s as a centerpiece for the China-Russia partnership that had been evolving. And even though I'm someone who has spent a lot of time criticizing that partnership and finding problems with it, I find myself now defending it in this instance because I think it does really link the two countries in a way that has not been true before. They're now linked through this oil pipeline and through the electricity connections that are existing from Russian hydropower plants in the Russian Far East, connecting down to Heilongjiang province in northeastern China. And so you do see a certain amount of economic integration that is cementing the political relationship, no matter how flawed and problematic it might be, how exasperated Russian and Chinese oil company representatives are at the end of the day of negotiations, but nonetheless, the two are connected in this way. In the case of Kazakhstan and China, the oil pipeline that went online even before the Russian one went online in 2006. The spur to Daqing just started working last year. Here we see push and pull factors at stake, what Philip Andrew Speed talks about in his latest book, where you had Kazakhstan interested in Chinese investment as a way of emerging from its previous exclusive involvement in the Russian pipeline system. For Kazakhstan, it was a way of diversifying its partners. And for China, it was also a way of integrating its Xinjiang province and creating a new oil and gas base in that province. And so I think that for China, there were domestic political goals also in terms of trying to create this source of development for Xinjiang and being able to connect it to other infrastructure projects in the region. Okay, what about international institutions? And there's a popular argument in the study of Chinese foreign policy that if China were able to become more of a participant in international institutions, China would become more of a stakeholder in the global governance system. And I think that the problem with this argument is that usually when it's studied, the institutions that are examined are ones where China does play an active role. And so what I'm finding in my work, in my case studies on water and food and health and oil, is that sometimes the institutions don't really address the problems that the international community faces in these areas. And sometimes China's not a participant in the institutions that do resolve the problems, or some of them. And so in this case, I think we see that the institutions that are available really play a limited role in resolving the problems that we face. You have a range of market issues involved in the global oil market. And these institutions aren't designed to address those issues. We also have various security dilemmas that arise from the interventions of various actors, China and its neighbors in the South China Sea, for example, or China and the US. And these organizations are also not designed to deal with those issues. So you have a kind of incompatibility of institutions and problems or risks. And China is not a member of some of the main organizations that might concern it. It's not a member of the International Energy Agency, not being an OECD state, not being a democracy, and not having 90-day reserves. It's not a member of OPEC because it's not one of the top oil-producing states, although it does produce oil. And it's not a member of the Malacca Straits Council, which regulates traffic in the Malacca Straits, because it's not a literal state. So China is not a member of these organizations, but it does have dialogues with them. It engages in workshops with the IEA. There have been a large number of high-level meetings with OPEC representatives. And China does engage bilaterally with the states on the Malacca Straits Council. But then China is a member, a participant, and even an initiator of a number of other organizations. And these organizations are regional for the most part on the right-hand side. There's a participant in the G8+3 meetings, which is a global organization. And the membership plays certain purpose in terms of information sharing and confidence building, but doesn't always get at all of the issues that create the security dilemmas and the perceptions of risks that China poses. And what about domestic sources of Chinese policies in the oil area? And there are three areas I want to discuss here. I'm going on a little long, but I'll try to talk faster and go through all of this. So I mentioned the fear earlier of a China incorporated locking up oil supplies, but the picture is much more complicated. If you read the work of Erica Downs and Bo Kong, you know that energy companies in China have a certain degree of autonomy. They're looking to make profit through their overseas investments because prices are controlled at home, so they make profits through the overseas investments. Chinese government has certain levers of control and provides subsidies in certain ways, but they don't always see eye to eye with the oil companies. And I'm going to go through this quickly so we have more time for questions. So regional politics is very interesting because in my work so far, I've seen that there are many regional factors that lead pipelines to be built when they wouldn't otherwise be cost effective. There's one case where it is cost effective, and that's the East Siberian pipeline, because previously Russia shipped oil by rail to China, and that was costly, and it was very time consuming because they have different rail gauges. It took a lot of time to switch the rail cars at the border, and so it was not the best way of shipping oil. And so that might make some sense. But normally, it costs twice as much to ship oil by pipeline than by ship. And so you're not saving money. And then the oil and gas that's transported by pipeline to China ends up in parts of China that usually doesn't really need those resources. And then they have to be shipped miles and miles to the eastern parts of China. So the whole thing has dubious cost savings. And so regional politics does play a big role in this, where the regions that are the recipients of the pipeline can use the employment and the associated development of the energy industry. So you have that kind of factor at stake. And also, it's not clear that building pipelines is any more secure than having shipping through the straits, because pipelines are fixed objects, can be easily targeted, and sometimes can be the subject of political disputes, as we've seen between Russia and Ukraine. So regional politics are a factor in China's pipeline investments, I would say. And then the final factor is one of the hardest to deal with, and that is the Chinese government promise to build a moderately well-off society. And what that has come to mean is a society of car owners. Um, and so many of you have been in Beijing traffic. That's Beijing traffic. And if you were buying gas recently in China, you know the price has increased. It's almost $5 a gallon now. And that's one man's reaction to this price increase. So you have the dream of the middle-class Chinese to own a car. And this was spurred on in part by the SARS crisis, when people feared going into public transportation. They wanted their own car. And then it became a symbol of prosperity. And so the Chinese government wants people to be satisfied, and this is a small thing to do to increase people's satisfaction. On the other hand, that means that oil has to be imported in great quantities. By 2020, there are expected to be 200 million cars in China. And so just think of the traffic and the costs for the environment, public health, et cetera. And what kind of cars are people buying? On the right side, we see the red Ferrari made famous by Bo Guagua, the son of Bo Xilai, who liked to drive around Beijing in one. And there you have the Prius, which is not very favored by Chinese customers who prefer to buy luxury sedans, SUVs, and other more prestigious and larger cars. And so how do you solve these problems? One wealthy businessman decided he would ride his horse to work because the traffic was too terrible. You have some Chinese governments that are investing in hybrid buses, and you do have incentives to buy hybrid vehicles. You have efforts by NGOs like Environmental Defense Fund in cooperation with the Chinese Civil Climate Action Network has tried to promote green commuting to encourage people to ride bicycles once again and to walk. But it's very difficult when definitions of participating in the middle class require owning at least a nice black sedan, if not a red Ferrari. So just to conclude here, so we have time for questions. China is vulnerable to a series of risks faced by its increasing demand for oil, and because of the global energy economy, so are its neighbors. Sometimes the actions that China takes to resolve these risks create security dilemmas. Markets can play a role in mediating some of these risks, but not all of them. Institutions help with information sharing, but can't necessarily resolve all those problems. And then the Chinese political and economic system creates incentives for perpetuating some of these risks that are going to be hard to deal with. And so what can we conclude from all of this? We need to find a way of bringing China into organizations that can actually do something about the problems that we face in the area of oil, perhaps by creating some kind of intermediate status in the IEA to accommodate not just China, but India and other states that are non-members, but whose actions would affect the security of supplies in the event of an emergency, or by creating some kind of energy task force in the G20, for example. And China needs to be encouraged to be more transparent in its energy projects overseas, to reduce some of the misperceptions in these security dilemmas. And we also need more sub-regional dialogues between the U.S. and China. I was looking through the list from the last year's Strategic Economic Dialogue, and the two areas that were missing from the sub-regional dialogues were the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And so I think these should be on the agenda if they're not already this year. And also our partners need to be encouraged to discuss some of these same issues with China. So I'll stop here and await your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. I found that enormously informative. You've obviously thought deeply about this important issue, really. Let me start, privilege of the chair, to ask one question. And I don't mean to expand the discussion, but I really would appreciate a few words on, you apparently, or I could gather, you think the oil risk is, if not, well, is it the most important one? That is, how can you give any priority to the various risks that you're going to be looking at between oil, water, food epidemics, the ones that you listed, is there any way to easily sort of suggest which of those are most serious, or are we left with saying they're all pretty serious?
That's a tough question. I was hoping not to deal with till I wrote the concluding chapter. I'm on
maybe
chapter
we should
2.
wait for the answer.
But in a preliminary way, I would say that some of the cases I'm studying deal with crises. Like the health chapter looks at avian flu, SARS, swine flu. So if you're in the middle of an epidemic, that's what's most important to you, not the price of gas. If your milk is contaminated, the health of your child is the most important thing. But I think that in a kind of structural, economic way, the oil issue is fundamental because it's so much a part of China's economic development. So in terms of a long-term risk, and this is in one of the few areas where China is actually trying to manage a risk. In the other areas, it's been more of a mobilization to a crisis. But here, with the 5-year plans and China's white papers on environmental issues, Chinese leaders are obviously thinking about how to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. But there are a number of factors that constrain the resolution of those risks.
Well, we'll await the conclusion. Questions or comments? Xia Feng? Wait just a second. If you'd identify yourself too, please.
Yafeng Xia, I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this very informative talks on China's rising demand for oil. I have 2 questions. Your title, you say, because China's, I'm not sure whether I understand correct, because you say that China's rising demand, so it become a rising, China's rising demand on oil, and it become a rising risk. How about the U.S.? Can you use the same word for the U.S., rising risk because of U.S. rising demand? Now, the second question, as you know, that there are many studies on this issue, China's rising oil demand. What particularly know from your current project, or what are the most important findings so far you found? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. What I didn't do in this presentation was to explain the framework for the project, which looks at the concept of social risk from the work of the German sociologist Ulrich Beck. And he looks at risk as the unintended consequence of economic and social and technological decisions. So the way that China uses oil in its economy, for example, is a result of those kinds of decisions. And all states produce risk. So the U.S. economy also, with its reliance, especially on car use, creates risks too. But what I'm arguing here is that the nature of China's economic and political system creates additional challenges for risk management because of the way you have public-private hybrid firms, you have limits to participation of society in policy. So I did mention there were some NGOs working on these issues, but they're very much at the, they're not at the center of these debates on energy risks in China. Even though the government wants to encourage these kinds of conservation and efficiency measures, there are other conflicting goals in terms of development, in terms of creating a moderately well-off society that counterbalance. You have regional pressures in the provinces for development, and the oil companies in China are very much seen as vehicles for employment. And so if you look at how many people these companies hire, many more people than other major oil companies, because their function is to create jobs and employment inside China, not just to have the most efficient company structure. And so I would say looking more at the domestic constraints on China's ability to manage these risks is what's different about this project.
Yes, sir.
Doug Norton. Appreciate your comments very much. One of the things that's happening in the United States is presenting the Department of Defense as an anchor tenant for the development of alternative fuels as a way to get drop-in fuel opportunities for the Defense Department that are not dependent upon fossil fuels for a variety of reasons, but mainly adaptability and security. Two questions. Is any of that happening in the PLA? And two, is that a viable area for bilateral discussion between the two sides?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it deserves further study. I have not looked at that issue so far. I think it's an avenue that I will look into, thanks to your question, and I think that it certainly is a worthy area for engagement, because the Chinese military will face those same concerns. So that's an area where the U.S. and China can fruitfully discuss risk management.
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question. With the study China itself, and one of the things that mystifies me is this obsession of trying to building a blue water.
Identify.
I'm Randall Doyle. I'm from Laogai Research Foundation. I mean, I understand it, but with the Indians building up their navy in the Indian Ocean, and with the United States having a predominant role in the Western Pacific, and the sea lanes are open for the most part, China building a navy, so to speak, kind of a Mahanian type of thing, defending its is not really in play because the United States isn't an aggressive power. It's not shutting off oil or gas to any country in Asia, especially to China. And I'm thinking that's my first question to ask you is, what is the strategic thinking behind that when there really isn't a threat, okay? Maybe in the back rooms they perceive it as a threat, but there's not really a public threat, and it's not really perceived by anybody in the Western Pacific region that somehow oil and gas will be cut off by the United States or by the Indians. So, and the second thing is, I noticed all these pipelines. I've been writing all these pipelines down that are in play here. How much of that, what percentage of the Chinese needs are being met by those pipelines? Because obviously they play a vital role in energy or thing, and they're very important. But what percentage altogether of these ones you have on your map here are, what percentage are they meeting the Chinese needs?
Okay, well, if we look, the ones that are built, there you have the Russia-China one from you see Taishet to Daqing there in the green, and you have the pipeline from Kazakhstan there to western China, and so Kazakhstan provides 4% of China's energy, and Russia 6%, and this is transported now by pipeline, and so it's still minority share of what China is importing. But to answer your first question, I mean, there are some critical analyses among Chinese academics about this naval modernization scenario too, because it rests on the Taiwan conflict scenario, that in case of a conflict between the U.S. and China, one mechanism the U.S. could employ would be to seek to block off the Malacca Straits. And our military planners also, if you read the DoD reports, that's the number one scenario that's used. Although it might seem less likely at the moment because of easing of tensions across the straits, but that still is a scenario military planners look at. If I were a Chinese military planner, I would be thinking about the Strait of Hormuz also at the moment, because you have the issue of Iran potentially, or threatening at least, to block off the strait in event of an attack by Israel on its nuclear facilities. And so that's not the scenario. That wasn't the number one scenario for Chinese military planners. It wasn't supposed to be Iran, which is a supposedly friendly country. It was supposed to be the United States, where more of a competitor that might do this. And so I think that there are a lot of different scenarios that have to be examined. And I'm not saying that there's agreement in China to build a blue water navy. I'm saying that there is a trend towards military modernization in the Navy for a variety of missions. Most of them are non-traditional security missions in terms of anti-piracy, disaster relief, et cetera, to be able. China was asked to go patrol in the Gulf of Aden when there were problems with piracy. And so there is a need for expanding the capabilities of shipping. Question is, what is the ultimate purpose? And then there are different, or what should be the ultimate purpose? And there are different views within the Chinese military about that.
If we could get some others maybe before we come back, I'd like to spread it around. Was there someone back there in the back? No? Right here then?
Thank you. That's right. Paris Wang from The Voice of America. You mentioned about since China is such a big country and a big oil consumer, it's naturally that whatever the strategy is or the policy is would affect the oil market and the oil price. I'm just wondering, can you elaborate on how powerful China's capability on impacting the oil market right now? And is it possible that it can be used as a strategic, not weapon, but, like, for example, like right now, a lot of people are upset about Obama because the oil price is up. And also in Taiwan, a lot of people are upset over the current president because of oil price. So is it possible that the China might be powerful enough on this side that it can actually influence other countries' politics in the future?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You're asking for China's impact on the oil market, or?
Yes, it's how large is the impact on the oil market right now? And is it possible the impact might be large enough that might be able to drive up the oil prices as a strategic weapon against some other nations?
Well, the one thing to remember is that if prices go up in general in the oil market, then China also faces inflationary pressures. And so it would backfire because Chinese consumers would face higher costs. And so I don't think that's a very effective weapon. The point I was making was that China's impact is large because it is the second largest consumer of oil. And so if China is going to stockpile its reserves, for example, which on the one hand is a beneficial policy because it means that in the case of an emergency, let's say Iran does blockade the Strait of Hormuz, then China has more reserves and is less likely to act in unpredictable ways that could destabilize things. On the other hand, if China is buying more than usual on the market, this means that if there isn't more oil produced at that moment, depending on availability of supplies elsewhere, and there have been restrictions because of instability in the Middle East, the Iranian situation, Libya, et cetera, then the price of oil could be increasing. So I wasn't saying that this was going to be an intentional policy by China, rather that there are effects because China is a part of this global energy market. And then you also have speculators who trade in oil futures, and to the extent that China would participate in this, that they could affect the price of oil. But I haven't looked into that very comprehensively to say.
In the back, yes.
Thank you. I'm Pete Shutley from Brookings. My question is about Chinese behavior in the International Energy Agency. That was created after the first oil shock in 73 and 74, and one of the purposes of it is for countries to coordinate. And my question is, does China behave constructively in that institution? Do they give announcements when they plan additional purchases, or are they willing to share information, or how do they behave in that outfit?
Well, China's not a member of the International Energy Agency. That's restricted to OECD democracies that have 90 days of reserves. And China doesn't fit into any one of those three categories. And so it has an associated membership, an associated relationship, and so it does provide some information. It does participate in some workshops and meetings, but it doesn't face the requirements of that other members would. And from my discussions with people in China, there's some suspicion about what the agency actually does. what would membership mean? It's not clear, I think, to even energy analysts what would be the benefits. And for the International Energy Agency, it would mean either changing its organization to admit China or to create an intermediate level of membership. This was something that Ken Lieberthal argued for 2006 in a publication he wrote for NBR, that there should be some way of promoting China's entry into the IEA, and that hasn't happened yet. And so China's outside that agency.
Bob?
Bob Hathaway here at the Center. Liz, let me just say we've really enjoyed having you here this spring, and we wish you weren't leaving as well next week. If I'm a defense planner in Beijing and I look at that map on the wall, I think it scares the heebie-jeebies out of me. The way I would read it, it would suggest an absolutely crippling vulnerability because so much of the country's energy imports come through this one bottleneck in the Strait of Malacca. My question is, what are the probabilities over, say, a 20-year period, if China does all the sensible things, diversifies its sources of oil supply, relies more on other types of energy, makes significant advances in conservation, new pipelines, all the things they might do. I'm going to guess that they're still going to be very dependent on overseas sources of oil, and moreover, that no matter how they diversify their sources of this oil, an awful lot of it is still going to have to come through the Strait of Malacca, and therefore, even under the best scenario, I, as a Chinese defense planner, see myself still facing an immense vulnerability as far out as 20 years. Is that a correct or an incorrect analysis from the standpoint of a reasonable defense analysis?
I think most Chinese defense analysts would agree with that. They would also point to the fact that Chinese oil shipments often use foreign tankers, not Chinese tankers. So one of the priorities is to increase the percentage of Chinese-owned tankers for shipping oil. But there are some minority voices that say, well, it's not very likely for anyone to shut off the Malacca Straits because it would disrupt global energy trade, not just China's energy trade. That there isn't that much congestion for this to happen accidentally. And so if we're to look at the history of the use of the Malacca Straits, we can be a little bit more reassured. But defense planners are of course asked to look at contingencies, and they would not be sleeping peacefully at night looking at this map. I would agree with that. But it's not just the transportation, it's also the nature of the development model and the nature of the society, which increasingly is dependent on fossil fuels. And I think that the current, if the current type of development is perpetuated, China is going to find itself very vulnerable to these pressures. Creating car ownership. The question about U.S. risks, I think, is a good one, because here the Chinese are learning from the bad example of the United States, where previously China had a very sustainable transportation model in terms of using bicycles and public transportation. Cities have been completely reconstructed to accommodate cars. Sidewalks have been ripped out to put in highways. And so this is not a sustainable...
No bike lanes.
What?
No bike lanes.
No bike lanes, that's right. So it's not very sustainable, and if people are going to associate their status in society with car ownership, then this also creates incentives for perpetuating the same vulnerabilities. And so I don't know how the government can, on the one hand, provide to the burgeoning middle class the fruits of prosperity, and the other hand, regulate use of oil. It's very difficult.
Yes, in the back.
Arturo Lopez Levy from the University of Denver. Could you talk a little about the role of oil in Chinese policy towards Latin America?
This is a little bit outside my study because I'm dealing with China and the Asia-Pacific region, focusing on relations with neighbors. So I left out Latin America because of that reason. But just suffice it to say that I think that the issue of is China locking up supplies and will this harm U.S. interests, that comes up in the case of Latin America, where China has contracts with many countries there. I think that's a case where China sells these supplies of oil on the market, far from China. It's not necessarily the kind of oil that China uses. And so while these assets are close to the United States, maybe they compete with U.S. companies in terms of access, the end product ends up on the market that U.S. consumers can buy as well. So I think some of the concerns about Chinese investments in Latin America are a bit overblown in that way.
Maybe we'll take 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am, back there.
Hi, I'm Meredith Miller from the National Bureau of Asian Research, and I wanted to come back to this question of how you will evaluate risk in your final analysis, and I'm particularly interested in how the economic risk ties back to political. As Bob said, I think a military planner would be very nervous looking at the map of the Malacca Straits, but it strikes me that the more realistic scenario would be a short-term disruption which causes a price spike, which causes an economic slowdown. How does that play out in terms of domestic politics in China, and will that be part of your final analysis?
Well, the final analysis is going to be looking at some of the interrelationships between different types of risks. For example, how does oil risk relate to water risk? And I was just looking at some of that this afternoon, and I think there you see some problems, because if you look at where the oil industry is located in China, you have the Heilongjiang province and northeastern China, and Xinjiang province in western China, both of which are big agricultural producers and also face water shortages. The oil industry needs a lot of water, and then water that is released from the oil industry is often polluted. And so you have a compounding of risks in terms of the impact of the oil industry on the water situation in China, which is already very difficult. You also had a big accident in an oil company affiliate in northeastern China, PetroChina. Chemical plant had a big explosion in 2005, contaminating the water, leading to tensions and relations with Russia, which depended on that water. So the concluding chapter is meant to look at the interaction among these different risks. And so you could see also a relationship between food, energy, and water. If these are agricultural provinces that are also the centers of the oil industry, how do you balance the need for food security, water security, and then energy security? That's going to be the hard task that awaits me once I get to the very end of this study. But thank you for your question, which I'll keep in mind.
Yeah. Bob?
Thank you. Robert Keatley. In terms of oil risk, does China help itself or hurt itself with its claims in the South China Sea? Or has that been, is that a nationalistic issue that hasn't been factored into people who worry about energy security?
That's a tough question, because I think China's assertive protection of its historical rights, I think, creates some disincentives for others to embark on projects. And we saw BP pull out of one example. But on the other hand, it creates a lot of concern about China's intentions in the region, potentially damaging relations with other states. And being that many of these projects would likely be cooperative, given the overlapping claims, China might need to pursue some of these energy interests along with other states. And this is an issue that arises in terms of the security of the sea lanes. One proposal I read by a Chinese academic was to have a China-sponsored security force for the Malacca Straits. Oh, and that's going to go over very well, given the current political climate around China's claims in the South China Sea. But of course, it's not just China. Other states are also assertively pressing their claims, and the Philippines and Vietnam, and it's hard to tease out, where this all started. So I think it's not just the U.S. also was becoming more engaged in this region after a long while, and so there are a lot of forces at stake. But certainly Chinese behavior has been the subject of notice, and it may not facilitate cooperative frameworks in the short term. Although I think what the purpose from the point of view of Chinese leadership, if there's, to the extent that there is a coordinated strategy, which I'm not sure there is to create, to kind of hedge their bets in terms of what might be potentially possible for them to claim. But anyone who's interested in this, I urge to read the latest International Crisis Group report on this, which talks about all of the many agencies involved in the South China Sea and refers to a Chinese analyst who called them 9 dragons and much noise in terms of all the competing interests that are involved in that region and why this creates ambiguity in Chinese policy.
I think we should bring things to a close. This has been fascinating. And please join me in thanking Elizabeth for this stimulating talk.